Good afternoon and welcome to Day 3 of the State of Energy Research Conference, the second such national conference. My name is Bruce Mountain. I'm the Director of the Victoria Energy Policy Centre. Let me begin by acknowledging the First Peoples on whose lands I am speaking to you, the Jar Jar people. Their land was never ceded. I pay my respects to their elders past, present. I welcome you to the third day of the conference. I will be hosting the keynote and 2 plenary sessions for the next 2.5 hours. There is already a great deal of water under the bridge over the last couple of days, and those who have tuned in for the last 2 days will have had to absorb a great deal of interesting content. So I thought I might start my session today, prior to introducing the key speakers, by spending a minute or two reflecting on the water that has already passed under the bridge, and then I'll focus upstream on what is yet to come. Before introducing our first keynote speaker, let me share my screen for the next few minutes. But before I do that, let me encourage you to engage with the conference by submitting your questions and comments. There will be time after each speaker for these to be raised and chatted about. I would strongly encourage you to do that. I've seen speakers at this conference put a very great deal of effort, and we have the benefit of such a great array of speakers. Online is difficult, and I think a way to actually stay engaged is to actively participate by asking questions. Right, let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to recap what we have gone over the last couple of days. I'm sorry, what's that? Full screen, excuse me, I need a full screen. Okay, we have had 2 keynote speakers so far. Both have focused on research that we ought to be doing, thinking about what we ought to be doing, and to some degree how we ought to be doing it. As any researcher will know, setting the agenda is one of the hardest things, and both speakers have put a great deal of effort into their talks. I know I will be spending time reflecting on what they have said. We have then had 2 excellent talks. The first telling us about climate science, or bringing into our consciousness the climate science, the underlying drumbeat of so much of what frames our work. And the second telling us about the enormous Race for 2030 program, which will drive a great deal of research. We then had 2 great panel discussions, the first focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and how to take them out of the hard sectors. Sorry? Sorry, excuse me, I've been interrupted too. Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking me to do. Right, yeah. We've then had 2 great general panels, as I've spoken about, and finally we had panel sessions in our 3 buckets. And if we have a look at some of the titles in those buckets, a great deal has been about trust, fairness, hydrogen, batteries, get many mentions. Right, let me turn to what lies ahead for us now. We have a keynote, a plenary and a panel. I'll be chairing sessions for the next 2.5 hours. The keynote by Dr. Alan Finkel, I've called research that makes a constructive area for us to actually move ahead in the energy changes. I was told just before the speech by Dr. Finkel, I should call it drumbeats for change. We then move to a plenary, which will be spoken to by Prof Hill, and the value of systems research for the energy changes, and then the competition between central and decentralized power, a panel discussion. The next hour and a half of the conference, after a break, 3 buckets, we can see again considerable interest in hydrogen, fairness, equity, social justice, EVs, and then a range of talks on tools. Let me introduce now our keynote speaker. He hardly needs an introduction, a neuroscientist and engineer who's had a life of enormous contribution in the public sector and in the private sector. Currently chair of a number of councils and played a key role in framing the agenda for change by the federal government. He was previously the chief scientist, the chancellor, chair of the NEM review, which has framed up the ESB and a number of changes which are being implemented, and entrepreneur who has successfully built both hardware and software businesses. And I learned recently drives the only privately owned hydrogen car, which I was told just before this his wife is about to use for the first time. Without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Finkel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that kind introduction, and a little bit of quirkiness always makes it more interesting. And certainly when I put my hand to my ear, I can hear the drums of change beating. The way I see it, we've begun a decade of global technology deployment that will define our ability to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and preserve our planet. The challenge is to do so without compromising our current and future standards of living. Now, some people, they think it's easy. I've got solar panels on my roof and a battery in the backyard, they say. Problem solved. What's wrong with the government? Well, in truth, while we can rightly celebrate all the extraordinary progress that we have made, we must remind ourselves of the work still ahead. As huge swathes of humanity emerge from poverty to enter middle class, the demand for energy and goods continues to rise, and so do emissions. Slowing or reversing the progress of billions of people out of poverty is not acceptable. Depopulating the cities and encouraging residents to adopt a frugal lifestyle is just not practical. Population control, cutting the consumption of goods and services, reducing air travel, and eliminating red meat from our diets are all unrealistic. To be clear, there is simply no way that humanity is going to voluntarily give up the extraordinary opportunities that a plentiful energy supply has brought us. So given this, we have no option but to replace the high emissions technologies we have used for centuries with 21st century clean alternatives. Technology to solve technology's problems. To do so, we will need ongoing science and engineering, innovation to build on what we have. We will need to increase the pace, reduce the price, and minimize the resource impacts. Zero emissions technologies will provide the necessities, the sustenance, and the indulgences that we unequivocally demand and developing countries deserve. However, the reality is that most of the zero emissions technologies require us to relearn how we do things. And almost without exception, they start life vastly more expensive than the high emissions incumbents. Adopting the solutions at scale globally, therefore, will require trillions of dollars in market-driven and government investment. It will require clear articulation and implementation of sensible long-term government policies. It will require sustainable markets that endure well beyond the early government incentives and subsidies. And it will require developers to earn the respect of local communities so that those communities embrace wind farms, solar farms, transmission lines, carbon dioxide stored deep underground, large-scale hydroelectric schemes, and pumped hydro storage dams. We simply cannot determine the exact pathway to get to net zero. If we did, you could all retire from research and go off and join engineering and agricultural companies to help them produce and deliver what we already know. Knowing that there is still much to discover, and although I wasn't involved in the government's modelling to deliver net zero by 2050, I was pleased to see that the modelling explicitly acknowledged the important role of fundamental and translational research by stating that 15% of what we will require to get to net zero will be from further technology breakthroughs. And I was stunned to see this allowance disparaged by some international and domestic critics. What this allowance does is acknowledge the reality that ongoing research, innovation, and the expression of human ingenuity over the next 29 years will deliver solutions that we cannot possibly conceive of today, let alone include with precision in a model. If, as the critics wanted, the modelling had assumed full knowledge today of everything we will need in order to get to net zero, that would be outrageous. By incorporating the role of new breakthroughs, the modelling implicitly acknowledges the role that each of you can play to make progress. On this, I want to discuss how best to effectively contribute, and I want to provide a few words on goal setting. To start, on the issue of effective contributions, it is my experience that a positive approach brings more reward than a negative approach. Each of you has to make your own decision about the public stand you will take in your research goals. But let me share an insight. Currently, there is a widespread assumption that our political leaders poorly understand scientific matters and need to be better informed. I saw this default assumption of ignorance in spades last year when friends and strangers would write to me about rapid antigen tests for home testing, or oxygen hoods for intensive care beds, or a preprint about modelling, with the request that I inform the minister or the officials at the Department of Health. As it happened, there was nothing that the senior public servants didn't know already, and they were routinely briefing the health minister either directly or through his office. Despite public perceptions, politicians are not ignorant. In fact, it is remarkable how much they know, juggle, and take into account. For this reason, lecturing politicians on the need for climate action is ineffectual. Their challenge does not lie in accepting the science, but in finding the balance between emissions reductions and their perceptions of how to best safeguard Australian jobs and economic growth. The best way to have impact is to offer help. A desire to help is what motivated many of Australia's leading academic researchers last year to create the Rapid Research Information Forum. The strength of the rapid research reports produced by the forum is that they analyse complex issues through a multitude of lenses: scientific, societal, and economic. They quickly synthesise them into a report for policymakers without making any recommendations. The politicians pose the questions, and they appreciate the insights provided by the academics. It is also important not to arbitrarily shut out legitimate ways forward. For example, there was a paper published earlier this year by US researchers that concluded blue hydrogen is not only worse than green hydrogen, but that it would be better to use the methane directly than convert it to hydrogen. This conclusion was based on a series of worst-case assumptions, including that upstream emissions are worse than the rates used in the National Greenhouse Inventory, and that developers in future will not take active steps to improve them. The paper further assumed that the steam methane reforming units in future will continue to burn methane for process heat and pressure, rather than assuming that proponents will install new units that will use renewable electricity for process heat and pressure. And it assumed that the carbon capture process will only be weakly implemented. To the contrary, my view is that there will be global adoption of a hydrogen guarantee of origin system. Consequently, knowing that buyers will demand to know the byproduct emissions during production, future hydrogen producers will be highly motivated to minimize upstream emissions, to use zero-emission steam methane reforming units, and to implement carbon capture and storage at high capture rates. Equally problematic is criticism that is blind to visible progress. It saddens me when I see learned academies take that kind of a position. In my experience, the number one rule if you want to be heard is to start by acknowledging what has been achieved before promoting your idea or expressing your concern. Compliment politicians from time to time when they do well. After all, they are human and they will appreciate it. Some small steps in the right direction should be celebrated rather than slammed for being inadequate. I have not undertaken any kind of extensive review, but the only society that I have seen embrace this approach is the Institution of Chemical Engineers, headquartered in London, representing chemical engineers in more than 100 countries. After a brief but powerful statement regarding the climate emergency, their position paper immediately transitions to listing what chemical engineers can do to help. They acknowledge that chemical engineers are well placed to assist all industrial sectors to, and I'm quoting, arrest and reverse the damage we humans are doing to the life support system of our single shared planet. And for this reason, they are updating their code of conduct to include an obligation on all professional members to act in accordance with the principles of sustainability. They commit as a professional society to take a lead role in tackling climate change, working with all stakeholders, from governments to communities around the world, to deliver a fair, safe, and sustainable future. They will contribute through their members' jobs, through education, and through research. They offer to provide advice to governments based on chemical engineering experience and expertise. That is, specific advice that can show how the skill sets of chemical engineers can make a difference. In the absence of institutional guidance, what can individual scientists do? I was Chancellor of Monash University, and one of the job requirements was to learn lots of quotes from General Sir John Monash. And one of the most memorable things he wrote was, and I am quoting, "Adopt as your fundamental creed that you will equip yourself for life, not solely for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole community." Now, if I challenged you to equip yourself for a life in research, not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of the whole of community transition to net zero, what would you do? It may be that in the spirit of community, your research field is community engagement and social license. This is an area that needs focus because the developer community clearly hasn't succeeded, whether in resources such as natural gas, renewables such as wind and solar farms, or transmission lines required to connect the renewable energy zones to the metropolitan loads. Or you could work towards providing greater clarity on carbon capture and storage, which is wrongly framed as an attempt to prolong the use of coal-fired electricity. That is simply not the case. The reality is that the economics of carbon capture and storage for coal-fired electricity are so poor that there is no financial or developer appetite to invest in CCS for coal-fired electricity generation. And as you know, there are low-cost, clean alternatives for electricity generation. But there are hard-to-abate industrial processes for which CCS is absolutely necessary. And if we are to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it is likely that biosequestration will not be sufficient, and we will have to invest in direct air carbon capture and storage. For these reasons, the IPCC, the IEA, the Biden administration, the UK government, and the Norwegian government, among others, are strong advocates of the need to invest in CCS. Another difficult to explain area is the role of natural gas in supporting the rapidly growing penetration of solar and wind generation into our national electricity grid. We will also need research into understanding what forms of control are required on the use of rooftop solar and which are acceptable. Another field for community engagement and social license research, aligned with the low emissions technology roadmap, might be to anticipate the expectations and interests of consumers in the proposed voluntary zero emissions gas scheme. This will be a scheme like the existing green power scheme for electricity that will provide a way for Australian consumers and businesses to pay for up to 100% methane from waste or clean hydrogen. Like green power, the molecules will not be delivered directly to the premises, but the proportion of zero emissions gas injected into the distribution system will be increased by an equivalent amount. Whether the issue is transmission line rights of way or zero emissions gas schemes, it is not a matter of convincing communities. It is a matter of earning their support. That's complex, and it is clear over many years that developers and regulators don't yet have it right. There is therefore an inviting opportunity for social scientists to provide clarity around these issues. Let me shift to my second major topic, goal setting. The best place to start is to define the problem. Now, this may sound trite, but it is the crucially important first step that is too often skipped by people from all fields. Aristotle said, asking the right question is half the answer. Identify the biggest problems you think you can contribute to, and then focus on them. If there are too many to deal with, take a systematic approach. For example, apply some filtering based on impact. That's the method we used in the low emissions technology roadmap. We started with 140 technologies identified in 2019. By early 2020, we had narrowed the list to about 40. Then, working as an advisory committee, we narrowed the list to a portfolio of 5 priority technologies, selected through the 4 filters of abatement potential, economic benefit, Australia's comparative advantage, and responsiveness to government investment. If you have not already done so, you might want to ponder what filters you would apply to your own research. Next, you might give consideration to where in the research and development pipeline you want to play. In the clean tech area, more so than any other area in the Australian research landscape, we have an optimal development to deployment pipeline anchored on 4 key pillars: fundamental research at our universities, translational research through the CSIRO and our cooperative research centres, demonstration programs through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and early commercial deployment through the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So you obviously have to think about where your research interests lie, and also the extent to which you are prepared to test the limits of your comfort zone by moving fluidly back and forth between 2 of these pillars, rather than being committed forever to just one of them. Of course, there are other sources of funding: university income applied to research, industry funding, and even philanthropy. University income applied to energy research can be quite substantial in normal times. Unfortunately, the pandemic has temporarily shattered all the norms. Industry funding depends greatly on how relevant you can make your research to the real world and your ability to meet the rapid turnaround needs of industry. Philanthropic support is less likely, but you never know, unless you try. You could build your filters on the answers to questions such as, can I align my research to the priority technologies in the Australian government's low emissions technology roadmap? Let me just reiterate what they are. Low-cost clean hydrogen, ultra-low-cost solar electricity, low-cost electrical energy storage for short durations up to 8 hours and for long durations up to many days, zero-emission steel and the end-to-end supply chain, zero-emissions aluminium and the end-to-end supply chain, low-cost storage of captured carbon dioxide, and low-cost soil organic carbon measurement. Take steelmaking as an example. The buzz is around the use of hydrogen and renewable electricity instead of metallurgical coal to produce direct reduced iron. Huge amounts of research and development will be required to solve the cost and efficiency issues and to ensure the suitability of our iron ores for these new processes. Anticipating an even bigger leap into the future, some researchers are thinking further outside the box, looking at renewable electricity in a molten oxide electrolysis smelter to eliminate the need not just for metallurgical coal, but for hydrogen too. You could also ask yourself whether you can align your research to the enabling infrastructures prioritized in the low emissions technology roadmap. And the first of these is the deployment of battery and hydrogen electric vehicle charging and refueling stations. The battery charging stations are already in the hands of manufacturers and possibly out of the realm of academic research. But hydrogen refueling stations are stunningly expensive and require some very different thinking to reduce their costs tenfold and to massively shrink their real estate footprint. The second priority enabling infrastructure is what we call the digital grid. That is the extremely powerful software that AEMO, the network service providers, developers, equipment makers, and others will need in order to optimize a high penetration solar and wind electricity grid. If this is an area of interest, I expect that you will engage with engineers at AEMO and perhaps at systems operators in international jurisdictions early on to understand their emerging needs, and then to the maximum extent practical and palatable, align your research work with their needs. In Australia, we are in the middle of several years of world-leading solar and wind capacity addition per person per year, and we have some of the most challenging technical conditions. It might be that your research can help preserve system stability in the presence of huge numbers of solar rooftops. It might be that you are an economist and can help preserve sustainable markets as the system shifts from one in which operational expenses dominate to one in which the marginal cost of operation are effectively zero. One last category in the roadmap for you to contemplate is emerging technologies, headlined by livestock feed supplements to reduce methane emissions and methods to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions from cement production. Take meat and livestock. We can use plant-based meat equivalents or lab-grown meat equivalents, but they have high emissions profiles too. Or we can directly address the existing problem by eliminating the methane emissions from enteric fermentation in cattle and sheep. Eliminating or vastly reducing methane from enteric fermentation could be achieved by providing feed supplements that interrupt the methanogenic pathway, by breeding cattle and sheep that do not have methanogenic bacteria, or by developing vaccines to eliminate the methanogenic bacteria. One of the emerging technologies that is still a twinkle in our eye, but a huge potential opportunity for Australia and the world, is direct air carbon capture and storage, sometimes referred to by the acronym DACS. I am sure you are familiar with it, but DACS basically consists of using fans to bring huge volumes of air containing one carbon dioxide molecule per 2,500 air molecules to a membrane of some kind that captures the carbon dioxide, which is then permanently sequestered. DAX is a form of negative emissions that will be key once everything else has been done to reduce emissions. The only problem is that DAX is much too expensive today. Therefore, lots of research and development will be required to cut the price by a factor of 10 or more. A broader question, yet crucially important as we look for alternatives to our coal and natural gas exports, is how do we find better ways to add value to our critical metals and minerals exports? For decades, the puzzle has been why we don't process more of our resources to higher value intermediaries before exporting them. It's not just an investment decision, it's a science and engineering question to address costs and efficiency. This year, one of my tasks has been to help broker clean tech bilateral partnerships between Australia and a number of other countries, including the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, Singapore, and Korea. These partnerships will fund demonstration scale projects in areas aligned with the roadmap. The implementation phase will begin next year, so please keep an eye open for announcements. My main point in all of these suggestions is for researchers to start by identifying the problem to be solved. Too often, researchers commence a discussion with me by describing the new research network they are going to implement or the new collaboration they are going to pursue. Structure is secondary. Problem identification is primary. Your goal in life every day should be to shift the dial. Yes, you need collaborations and grants, but the starting point should always be to define the problem and then help to solve it. I have no doubt you are up to the challenge and that this room is filled with the minds who will carry this endeavour forward and will expand it into a whole new realm of as yet unimagined possibilities and practical applications. Through this conference, we can dream and plan together. The drums of change are beating, and my hope is that we will all be members of the band rather than members of the audience. May the force be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That was excellent. I have to say, as I said to you privately after I'd read your speech, you gave me pause for thought, not just on content, but also on style, and perhaps both are important. And I suspect it'll be true for many of us listening, that what you say to both content and style. We have some questions, but prior to turning to those, one honor of being able to introduce you was that I get to have the first question. You are always at the cutting edge in your private life and in your life as an advisor and as chancellor and so on. You're always looking over the hill. Might it be that part of the research agenda should be focusing not just on things which are somewhat out of our grasp now, like CCS and advanced hydrogen and green hydrogen, that are prospects for the future, although very likely prospects for the future, but also making a change with the technologies that we have now? I often feel the research community kind of quite quickly moves into something very distant because it feels the need to look over there. Quite a lot is to be done in doing better what we know now. Arguably, many of our failures in the market has been not to do that. Do you feel that there is some value in our research community? And I guess this is probably more the social scientists than the proper scientists, who will always reaching further ahead, to be focused also on the problems of now, reaching a sizable reduction by 2030 and so on.
Oh, that's a very complex question that you've asked there, Bruce. There's no doubt that we need to look across the whole spectrum. And as I said in my speech, the clean tech area is privileged in Australia. Medical research does very well, But of them all, the clean tech area has the best structure with 4 pillars that define the pipeline. We have fundamental research, not adequately funded, but we have fundamental research that's done well in universities. We have translational researchers in the CSIRO and the CRCs. And then we've got arena funding a little bit of research, but mostly demonstration projects as you go up through the technology readiness level. And then eventually we get to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is a big bank, but a bank that's investing in those early stages. So we really do have places for researchers of every inclination to engage with the system. The next aspect of your question then is, what should motivate researchers? Well, to get to net zero, if that's our goal, you could argue that at least a little bit of probably everything we need is already visible to us. And so people can be getting more and more into the translational and demonstrations levels. But you know what it's like. We wouldn't have lasers, we wouldn't have lithium-ion batteries, we wouldn't have any of the things that we rely on today for communications and for emissions reduction if there hadn't been extraordinary people engaging in research just for the hell of it, because they loved it, they loved the concepts, they loved the theory. And that has to be nurtured and given opportunity. The important thing is, it doesn't matter which part of the pipeline that you're engaged in or playing in, you really have to have a focus on something better for the future. I would find it extraordinary for somebody to be doing research without any concept of how that might one day be converted into something useful. There are probably people who do that and do fantastic things, but I personally would find that very, very strange. My credo in life is, there's always a better way. And if you invest intelligence and determination and optimism, then you, as part of a community of other like-minded souls, can achieve a lot and shift the dial. And it's just always pays to be forward-looking. I just by nature, maybe it's just I have limited memory and recall. I don't dwell on the past. I'm always living in the present and thinking about the future. And if I had to choose, that's what I'd choose. It just happens to be the way I do things, but it's the present and the future that we should be focused on. But we should always have something better in mind that we're trying to help achieve. That's what I call shifting the dial in my speech.
Yeah, super. Alan, can I now put to you a question, quite a challenging question, the first one that came up, which I'm afraid I can't read because I don't have the skills to scroll on this, but I have it in my head, from Heather, whose surname I'm afraid I can't see. The gist of it was, it's inevitable that white male people will have a bias, just as it's inevitable that people making the criticism will have a bias. To what extent do you believe that the research agenda accounts for the diversity across the population? And are we aware, can we be aware of the biases that we have? Are they being addressed? How can we bring them into the research agenda?
I, as Chancellor of a university, as President of the Academy of Engineering, I've had 15 to 20 years now of seeing genuinely well-intentioned effort across the whole of the research system, from lecturers and deans, appointment committees, university vice-chancellors, granting bodies, and governments to do their best to, I don't know what you call it, level the playing field or ensure diversity. I really do think that the most that one can do is open the opportunities up, and people have to choose what they prefer to do. What you see is very much coloured by the glasses you wear. I feel that the system is giving a lot of opportunity to people from all walks of life, whether it's a gender issue or a social strata issue or a community background issue. One of the things I often say in speeches when I'm talking to younger researchers is do whatever you do well. Have a relentless commitment to quality. Doors of opportunity will open, but then step through. And so I would encourage everybody to step through those doors of opportunity. I think the doors of opportunity are there. I really can't say much more than that, Bruce. I think it's like a dance. It takes two to tango. People have to step up, but they also have to be given opportunity. Yes, there are pockets where that opportunity is not being provided, and those pockets have to be, exercised from the system. But in the main, certainly what I see from my 5 years as chief scientist, my 8 years as chancellor, and 3 years overlapping that in the Academy of Engineering, is that at all levels there is a genuine awareness and determination to do better. And I feel that we have made the system better. Yes, it can be better, but it's important to acknowledge, as I said in my speech, where progress has been made and build on that progress rather than ignore the progress, dismiss it, diminish the forego the positive feedback that you should be giving to the people who are trying to do well, and therefore diminish their satisfaction and confidence, and perhaps undermine the good things that they're doing.
Yeah, thank you. It is hard. Can I put to you another challenging question from Mr. Jorrit Gosens? Carbon capture and storage. I know in your speech you look ahead to the value of carbon, both in land use, but even more so in the ground for drawdown. But an argument is that the beneficiaries of R&D and carbon capture and storage will be the oil and gas majors. Should government be funding research that will benefit them, certainly for the foreseeable future? Hopefully drawdown will have a longer term benefit.
So I see that as just a failure to think about the potential here. As I said in my speech, I don't know personally anybody who's thinking about carbon capture and storage for prolonging the lifetime or enabling the construction of coal-fired electricity generators. It's been shown economically around the world not to work. There's been many attempts. There's only one working anywhere in the world, and that's in Canada. And it's very small. It's about 100 megawatts. So that's not happening. Carbon capture and storage in the low emissions technology roadmap, and in my mind, is for hard to abate sectors, for processes that might deliver genuine value, or for negative emissions. So hard to abate sectors, a good example is cement. I haven't come across any proposals that would, at scale, there are plenty that can do it at very, very small scale, but I've come across nothing that would, at scale, capture the emissions of carbon dioxide from cement production or eliminate the emissions other than carbon capture and storage. The emissions of carbon dioxide from cement production are part of the chemical process of converting limestone into lime. That's calcium carbonate into calcium oxide. And cement, depends which figures you look at, globally is responsible for up to about, I think, 8% of carbon dioxide emissions, probably 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's huge. Carbon capture and storage is the technology that everybody is looking towards. It has not been mastered at scale, but it is the technology that everybody's looking towards. If you go to the discussion of blue versus green hydrogen, to me, it's only meaningful in the context of a globally accepted guarantee of origin scheme that will show how much carbon dioxide is inadvertently emitted in the production of the fossil fuel pathway hydrogen, but also the electricity pathway hydrogen. And for the fossil fuel pathway hydrogen, CCS done properly, will be strictly required. And then the third category that I mentioned was negative emissions. And again, I mentioned that in my speech. We all talk about net zero, as everybody in this audience very well knows, because you can't get to zero emissions. There will always be residual emissions. We have to reduce as much as we can in the first instance, but then to get to net zero, or even to reverse the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You mentioned biosequestration. There's a lot of potential, but it's limited. There's almost unlimited potential through direct air capture and storage underground, and that is carbon capture and storage. And really, carbon dioxide taken out of the air, driven by solar electricity and buried permanently underground, it's possibly the only carbon offset that would pass the test of being 100% valid, because most carbon offsets, when you look at life cycle analysis and everything else that's associated with it, and internationally in some cases fraud and malintent, most of them have question marks. But if you're taking carbon dioxide out of the air and burying it under the ground essentially forever, that's a pretty credible ton of carbon dioxide that you've taken out of the air, and you should apply for a credit for it. So I just think there are too many areas where CCS can deliver value for us to not be giving it full consideration, and to not give consideration because for some reason it's seen as a scheme to direct money to the oil and gas companies, I think is focusing on the past rather than the importance of what the technology will deliver in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I guess that comes to your comment earlier that you live in the present and the future, which sounds entirely reasonable to me. We have another excellent question from Dr. Evan Franklin, a detailed question, and I think a very interesting one, and one that's probably dear to your heart. How do we measure greenness of hydrogen? For example, if it's using existing wind and solar capacity in the production of some power hydrogen, should we credit that with green hydrogen, or it's in a sense using electricity, green electricity that's here, not new electricity that's green? Should we only credit green hydrogen to ones associated with the construction of additional wind and solar capacity?
Bruce, thanks for that question. You'd have to be a real purist to say that you're only going to consider hydrogen as being, I won't call it green because I don't like the color coding, but exquisite. If it's made with solar or wind or hydroelectricity that's pre-existing and no longer needed surplus electricity. That's a very, very, very high bar. And if we apply that bar, not just to the production of what I've newly nominated as exquisite hydrogen, if we apply it to everything that we do, we will not be able to produce the energy we require in the future to replace coal, oil, and gas. We have a huge task ahead of us. Probably the single most depressing statistic that I've come across is the fact that in 1990, 87% of the global energy requirements were from oil, coal, and gas. Now, 30 years later, 83% of global energy requirements from oil, coal, and gas. It's a really difficult, massive challenge. So we are going to have to build not a little bit, not a lot, but extraordinary amounts of solar and wind and transmission lines and batteries to support it, and have clever markets to operate all of that in order to make the transition away from oil, coal, and gas. And we're going to need extraordinary amounts of hydrogen for those instances where electricity as electrons just don't give us what we need, such as in steel making. So I don't think that I could accept as a bar that you can't build new solar and wind. The good thing about solar and wind, say solar panels, is if you went back, I don't know, 20 years ago, you probably had an 8, 9 or 10-year payback period, because the factories that made them were running on coal or gas-fired electricity. But nowadays, the payback period for solar panels is somewhere between 2 and 4 years, but depending on where you're looking, and it's just getting better all the time as the whole of the industrial process and the mining processes are getting better. So I'd go with a forward-looking view, say that we need a lot of solar panels, we need a lot of wind turbines, we need to make sure that the industries that produce them are as green or as renewable as possible. For the most pure evaluation of the hydrogen, you would do a life cycle analysis, and I will point out that that would work against solar and wind and for natural gas hydrogen, because there's a much bigger resource investment in the solar and wind and electrolysis units for making hydrogen rather than methane. So it all gets very complicated. What the Australian government, based on the recommendations from the National Hydrogen Strategy that I chaired in 2019, has been doing is working through the International Partnership for the Hydrogen Economy, IPHE. It's actually a longer name than that, but it's called IPHE, to develop an internationally accepted numeric accreditation scheme called a Guarantee of Origin scheme. And that scheme is meant to be well to gate. So it's not just looking at the emissions of the production facility, it's looking at all the upstream emissions as well. And it also says, gosh, if you've got a solar and wind hydrogen facility, but you're running the pipeline to ship that hydrogen to your customer on grid electricity, take that into account too. Because these things aren't simple. And then countries that are importing hydrogen should set their own numeric threshold. And you can imagine some countries, Germany, if they were to be willing to import hydrogen from the steam methane process, would set a lower numeric threshold of acceptability than perhaps other countries. But without that accepted guarantee of origin scheme, we never know what we're getting. Calling it green, blue, turquoise, pink, yellow, or grey or brown doesn't give it.
Yeah, I must say, I think personally, one of the fantastically useful areas for research for social scientists and others is in exactly that. It's in customers knowing what they're getting and having a scheme that can be sure on it. Alan, we have only 2.5 minutes left. You've given us a great deal to think about on content and on style, as I was saying earlier. Can I give you a bit of a curveball and put you on the spot and say, if you could do one thing, just one thing, in your capacity, in leading, in advising, in being a major change agent, if you could do one thing for 2 minutes, what would you do? What would you really want to change first and foremost?
That is so much more difficult than you think, or maybe you think, and that's why you've asked it, because there is no single solution. But if I had to, under pain of being stuck up against a wall and shot by you, answer your question, I would say if we can only do one thing, I would invest all of our effort in decarbonising the electricity system. It's just so clear, not quite 3/4 of all of our greenhouse gas emissions come from the use of oil, coal and gas for energy. And all of that can be replaced by clean electricity. In Australia, that will be solar and wind. In some countries, it will be nuclear and hydro. In Tasmania, it will be hydro to a large extent. We can produce clean electricity and use that to replace all the oil, coal and gas. Some of that clean electricity will be used to make hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And getting rid of nearly 3/4 of our emissions is a fantastic head start, and the rest of it's quite hard. So my answer to your question is I would just direct all of my energy into decarbonising the electricity system and then tripling it or whatever's required in particular countries to replace oil, coal and gas for everything that oil, coal and gas is used for, even chemical feedstocks, because we can do that with synthesized hydrocarbons.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I think I couldn't agree more. Obviously, that's the area of my interest and of loads of others on this And we have the technologies, we have the knowledge, and we can get going on that while we improve our knowledge of a range of other fields. Alan, can I thank you very much for your time? You've put a lot of effort into your talk, and it's been of enormous value to me, and I'm very sure to many others. Can I mention to the audience, this will be on the Erica website for several weeks, and then there will be YouTube clips. I'll be, as I said, I've got your speech in writing, and I'm going to be reading it. Thank you very much again. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Bruce. Much appreciated.